The New England militiamen who spent the last week of April 1775 staring defiantly across the bay at the British garrison in Boston were really more of an armed mob than an army. This was not because they lacked for formal military training or experience. As we saw in Lecture 4, many of these militiamen had fought in the French and Indian War, only 12 years past. What they lacked was large-scale organization, because the largest unit any of them belonged to was a town company. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress, back in October, had made plans for coordinating the various town militias under the command of 6 general officers: Jedediah Preble, Artemus Ward, Seth Pomeroy, John Thomas, William Heath, and John Whitcomb, all of them veterans of the French and Indian War. But by the time the Congress prudently scattered on April 15th, before General Gage's sweep toward Lexington and Concord, the Congress's plans for a constitutional army had not gone much further than paper. Lexington and Concord changed that. When the Provincial Congress reassembled on April 21st, it suddenly had the soldiers, and now it had to invent the organization. What they came up with was a mirror image of the British system. Regiments of 600 men each in 10 companies, plus an artillery regiment. But the militiamen who had turned out for the alarm on April 19th were used to their own local companies and their own officers, and reshuffling them into regiments with provincial regimental officers and creating accurate regimental enlistment rolls took more time than anyone expected. Not until the end of June did the Massachusetts militia finally sort itself out into 26 regiments under the overall command of Artemus Ward. Unhappily, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had authority only over the Massachusetts militia. They could do nothing about the militia units which had joined them from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and eventually New Hampshire. Over time, the New Hampshiremen were organized into 3 regiments, like the Massachusetts militia, and these were placed under John Stark, Enoch Poor, and James Reed. The Rhode Islanders were also outfitted as 3 regiments, with all of them under the overall command of Nathaniel Greene, about whom we'll hear a whole lot more in Lecture 21. And the Connecticut legislature, sitting in a specially called session, took the hint from the other colonies and created 6 regiments for its troops as well. Now, all of this looked much more impressive than it really was. Fitting the militia companies into regiments was like trying to piece together parts from different puzzles. And the artillery regiment had little powder and fewer artillery pieces to harass the British by dropping shot onto their heads in Boston. A headquarters, of sorts, was improvised on the Common in Cambridge, with the kitchens of Harvard College pressed into service to cook meals. But the camps of these militia regiments were disorderly, and the regiments were so unevenly filled that recruiting parties had to be sent out into the countryside, thus reducing the number of men actually present to hold the long semicircle line that stretched from Medford to Roxbury. That became thinned out now to a very thin shield indeed. On April 20th, Dr. Joseph Warren, the president of the Provincial Congress's Committee of Safety, actually sent a letter to General Gage in Boston, gingerly suggesting that everyone sit down and talk matters over. And Warren even offered to allow loyalists in the hinterlands to seek refuge in Boston, if Gage would allow any rebel sympathizers who wanted to leave Boston likewise to exit. But Gage was having organizational difficulties of his own, mostly about making up his mind what to do. On the one hand, he moved immediately to disarm the civilian population of the city of Boston. On the other hand, he waited until June 12th to declare martial law. And he ignored a blustery demand by the commander of the small Royal Navy flotilla in Boston, Admiral Samuel Graves, that the Navy blow everything in Massachusetts that the Navy's guns could reach to smithereens. Gage did not want to go down as the man who had caused a war in America. But he was convinced, after Lexington and Concord, that he had too few soldiers on hand to attempt any further operations outside Boston. The debacle along the roadsides had taught him one very important lesson, and that is that every American who was killed or wounded could be replaced by recruits from over the next hill or in the next colony. But every redcoat whom Gage lost was irreplaceable, except by a long process of supply and reinforcement across the Atlantic Ocean that could take as long as 3 months. Besides, new orders from the Earl of Dartmouth, which arrived on May 25th, along with Generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne, authorized Gage to divert to Boston 4 more British infantry regiments. The 35th Regiment, the Orange Lilies, whose uniform we saw in Lecture 3, the 40th, the 49th, and the 63rd Regiments of Foot, all of them headed from the Caribbean to New York. There was no point, in Gage's view, to undertaking any further actions until those diverted troops had arrived in Boston. Gage was not the only Englishman who was surprised and uncertain about the turn of events in the colonies. When Parliament met in mid-January 1775, it was clear that many members were uneasy about the provocation offered by the Intolerable Acts. And on February 1st, 1775, the aged William Pitt, now Earl of Chatham, rose to ask for a suspension of the Intolerable Acts and recognition of the say of the colonial legislatures in all tax matters. Charles Pratt, the first Earl Camden, reported and supported Pitt's plea and denounced the Intolerable Acts as a bill of war. It draws the sword, he said, and in its necessary consequences plunges the empire into civil and unnatural war. With Lord Geoffrey Amherst and Admiral Augustus Keppel in the lead, senior serving officers who had the privilege of declining service in posts outside the British Isles quietly gave notice that they would not serve in an American war. Merchants from London, Norwich, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, all of them hurt by colonial boycotts of their products, begged for such healing remedies as can alone restore and establish the commerce between Great Britain and her colonies on a permanent foundation. Even within Lord North's cabinet, the Earl of Dartmouth, as the Secretary of State for America, thought Chatham's plan was worth considering. It was George III who was adamant. And so long as the King and Lord North, as his prime minister, could present the challenge in America as a make-or-break proposition on which the entire empire hung, Parliament would swing behind them. An address to the King, assuring him of full support in Parliament, passed the House of Commons 278 to 108, and the House of Lords 104 to 29. And in November, the Earl of Dartmouth, who was having those second thoughts about the Intolerable Acts, was replaced as Secretary of State for America by a militant hardliner, Lord George Germain. More about him in Lecture 7. As both British and Americans glowered at each other across the waters of the Massachusetts Bay, wondering what they could possibly do next, the conflict began to burst the boundaries of New England. 2 weeks after Lexington and Concord, a wealthy Connecticut merchant and militia captain named Benedict Arnold put a proposal into the hands of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. So long as the Army of Observation around Boston lacked artillery, it could do little to hurt the British across the waters of the bay. But to the west, the tumble-down British post at Ticonderoga warehoused 78 cannon, from light 4-pounders to the big knock-the-walls-down 24-pounders. And along with them, 6 mortars, 3 howitzers, round shot, musket balls, flints, everything they could possibly need. Arnold wanted the chance to seize these lightly guarded prizes, and the Congress's Committee of Safety obligingly commissioned him a colonel and authorized him to recruit a regiment of volunteers for an expedition into western Massachusetts and then into New York. When Arnold got on site, he learned that he was not the only one with an eye on Ticonderoga. The western counties of New Hampshire, the ones bordering on New York, had been a constant source of low-level friction between the two colonies, New Hampshire and New York. And the county militia there had been carrying on a bushwhacking resistance to New York authorities since 1770. This militia, known as the Green Mountain Boys, was commanded by Ethan Allen, who ultimately hoped to carve out an independent domain of Vermont between New Hampshire and New York. The supplies at Ticonderoga would obviously go a long way toward helping Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys achieve their goal. And since Ticonderoga was on New York territory, raiding Ticonderoga for those supplies would put a further twist in New York's tale. Benedict Arnold overtook Ethan Allen 20 miles from Ticonderoga, and since both of them wanted Ticonderoga, they struck a deal. Ethan Allen would allow Benedict Arnold to share command of an attack on Ticonderoga. Arnold would drape the protective authority of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress around Allen's raid. So together, at daybreak on May 10th, 1775, 83 Green Mountain Boys surprised the corporal's guard at Ticonderoga and seized the supplies. And seeing no other British forces on the ground to challenge him, Arnold borrowed a schooner the Green Mountain Boys had captured on Lake Champlain, and with 150 men sailed it north up the lake to Fort St. John, 20 miles south of Montreal, where he captured a 70-ton British sloop. Not only had he taken Ticonderoga, but by Arnold's action, the highway into Canada suddenly stood open. And the Governor-General of the Quebec province, Sir Guy Carleton, had only about 800 regulars in all of Canada to contest that. On the same day that Allen and Arnold captured Ticonderoga, a Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. With the news of Lexington and Concord still ringing in his ears, Massachusetts delegate John Adams believed that the time had finally arrived for the people of all the states to institute governments for themselves under their own authority, and that without loss of time, we ought to declare the colonies free, sovereign, and independent states, and only then offer to enter into negotiations with Britain. This opinion, as Adams ruefully admitted, was received with what he called horror, terror, and detestation by his fellow delegates. Reconciliation on equitable terms, not independence, was the overwhelming desire of the Continental Congress. We do not want to be independent. We are loyal subjects to our present most gracious sovereign. And in June, an olive branch petition was drafted by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, assuring the king that we not only most ardently desire that the former harmony of the colonies and the empire may be restored, but that a concord may be established between them upon so firm a basis as to perpetuate its blessings, uninterrupted by any further dissensions. Well, more about this olive branch petition when we come to Lecture 7. Nevertheless, petition or no, when the news of the capture of Ticonderoga arrived in Philadelphia, the Congress did nothing to deplore it or apologize for it, or to treat it as some kind of mistake. Anything but. On May 16th, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee moved that Congress authorize the creation of a combined colonial army, the American Continental Army. And as a first gesture, an all-light infantry force of expert riflemen was to be recruited from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland, and forwarded to Boston. Congress also assumed, in diplomatically vague terms, responsibility for the Army of the United Colonies gathered around Boston. And that suggested, in fairly broad terms, that the Continental Congress was converting the New England militia directly into a Continental Army, something which would have come as an unwelcome surprise to militiamen who still thought of themselves as temporary volunteers. The Congress, however, was specific. It was not vague on this point. Congress was specific about at least one aspect of this new army, and that was its generals and its general staff. Deferring to Massachusetts, Artemus Ward was designated as the first of 4 Continental Major Generals, followed by Charles Lee, who had seen service in the British Army in the 7 Years' War as a major, Philip Schuyler, an influential New York patrician who was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and the 57-year-old Israel Putnam of Connecticut. And as commander-in-chief and senior general of them all, the Congress turned to a 43-year-old Virginia squire, George Washington. Born in 1732, George Washington had never really wanted to be anything other than a soldier. His adored half-brother, Lawrence, had won a captaincy in a regiment of American volunteers raised in 1740 by Admiral Edward Vernon to attack the Spanish in the Caribbean. And it was Lawrence Washington who educated young George on the Northern Virginia estate he named for his former commander, Mount Vernon. When Lawrence Washington died in 1752, George was in line to inherit Mount Vernon, and with it his brother's post as major in the district militia. Within 2 years, Washington was appointed lieutenant colonel of the militia, and he was sent by the royal governor of Virginia to clear the French out of land that Virginia claimed near the forks of the Ohio River. Well, as it turned out, the French were there in greater strength than Washington had realized, and Washington and the militia battalion he commanded were surrounded, captured, and paroled back to Virginia. This event turned out to be the trigger which began the French and Indian War. But instead of it covering Washington with blame, it opened up his greatest opportunity yet. In 1755, the imperial government decided to dispatch 2 regiments of regular British infantry, the 44th and 48th Foot, to America under General Edward Braddock to deal with the French. Braddock invited Washington to join his staff, and even wangled Washington a temporary commission as a captain in the regulars. Unhappily, Braddock and his troops met with disaster at the hands of the French and Indians in an ambush at the Battle of the Monongahela. Washington took command of the Virginia militia accompanying Braddock and screened the retreat of the regulars, among whom, incidentally, was a junior officer in the 44th Foot named Thomas Gage. The Virginians, Washington reported to the governor of Virginia, performed heroically. The Virginians behaved like men and died like soldiers, he said. For I believe out of 3 companies that were there that day, scarce 30 were left alive. The fault for the defeat lay with the dastardly behavior of the English soldiers, who exposed all those who were inclined to do their duty to almost certain death. The Monongahela ambush and the way he covered the retreat of those who survived it made Washington into something of a hero. But it did not get him any further combat action, and it certainly didn't get his temporary regular rank of captain in the British Army confirmed. So in 1759, he married a wealthy widow, Martha Dandridge Custis, took his seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and hung up his blue militia uniform in favor of the life of a gentleman farmer. Like many Virginia planters, Washington soon learned that he was not quite the master of his situation at Mount Vernon. For one thing, any ambitions he had for purchasing and developing new land in the West were restricted by regulations on Western land speculation imposed by the imperial government. The crops he grew, principally tobacco, required shipping to Britain to find markets, and that put him at the mercy of brokers who charged punishing commissions and fees. That many families are reduced, almost if not quite, to penury and want from the low ebb of their fortunes, and estates daily selling for the discharge of debts, the public papers furnish but too many melancholy proofs of, Washington complained. The imposition of the new taxes of the 1760s, beginning with the Stamp Act, alienated Washington still more. The Stamp Act, imposed on the colonies by the Parliament of Great Britain, engrosses the conversation of the speculative part of the colonists, Washington wrote in the fall of 1765. They look upon this unconstitutional method of taxation as a direful attack upon their liberties and loudly exclaim against the violation. By 1769, Washington had become convinced that our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedom. So fully as much as any English Whig, Washington suspected that a regular, systematic plan had been formed to fix the right and practice of taxation upon us. With words like that, in August of 1774, he was selected as one of the Virginia delegates to the First Continental Congress. It's worth wondering what a well-to-do Virginia gentry planter thought he had to gain from defying the authority of the British Crown, especially since Virginia planters had a good deal more than Samuel Adams or Ethan Allen to lose by such defiance. The Scottish nobles who rose in rebellion behind Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745 offered a terrifying example of how savagely the empire's English overlords punished rebellion, since they lost their lands, their titles, sometimes even their lives, to English vengeance. But the fire that the king's men could light in front of the Virginia gentry like that was not nearly as frightening as the fire that could be ignited behind them among their slaves. By the 1770s, slave labor had been a part of colonial life for 150 years, and it was the ugly secret that lay at the foundation of American prosperity. The colonies had been established on the backs of various forms of forced labor: convicts, indentured servants, prisoners of war. But slavery emerged as the single most important system of compulsory labor, largely because it was fed by a highly lucrative flow of captive Africans across the Atlantic. Although the British North American colonies only received about 10% of the 11 million African slaves transported to the New World between 1500 and 1830, black slavery was a presence in each one of those colonies, from 4,000 slaves in Rhode Island to 170,000 in Washington's Virginia. Even at the end of his life, Washington owned 316 slaves. Overall, slaves accounted for 20% of the population of the 13 colonies. And these slaves were both an asset and a threat. They were an asset in that they worked the fields and performed the skilled crafts that Washington needed at Mount Vernon. But they were a threat because of the ever-present possibility of a slave revolt. The famous English dictionary maker, Samuel Johnson, thought it was hypocrisy of the highest order for American slave owners to whine about the slavery of British taxation. How is it, said Dr. Johnson, that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? But it was precisely the close observation of real enslavement by the slave owners which bred into them a dread of British control, lest they find themselves reduced to the same circumstances vis-a-vis Great Britain as their own slaves vis-a-vis themselves. Still, it would have been folly for Virginians like Washington to have made rebellion respectable, or lose the implicit support every planter would enjoy from British regulars in the event of a slave uprising, unless, of course, the British were inciting that uprising themselves. 2 days after Lexington and Concord, the royal governor of Virginia, John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, attempted his own version of Thomas Gage's preemptive strike against colonial military supplies by raiding the colonial powder magazine in Williamsburg and moving the powder to the safer confines of HMS Fowey in the James River. This touched off militia musters across the colony of Virginia and a threat of marching to Williamsburg. Dunmore took counsel of despair and fled to the Fowey himself. And from there, on May 1st, he volleyed back at his colony with a plan to arm all my own Negroes and receive all others that will come to me whom I shall declare free. The very whisper that Dunmore planned to recruit and arm the slaves of Virginia planters and turn them against their masters chilled Virginia blood. Massacres and instigated insurrections were the words in the mouth of every child, remembered one British official. Dunmore finally issued a proclamation in November declaring all indented servants, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing the colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. That brought any fence-sitters among the Virginia gentry down onto the Continental Congress's side with a thump. Nothing Dunmore could have done, said one planter, could equal his damned, infernal, diabolical proclamation declaring freedom to all our slaves who will join him. Eventually, nearly 1,000 slaves fled to Dunmore's standard, 300 of them being formed into what Dunmore called his Ethiopian Regiment. Among the runaways was one of George Washington's grooms, Harry, a Gambian, born in 1740 in Africa, sold into slavery in 1763, and who served out the balance of the war as a member of an unarmed service unit called the Black Pioneers. George Washington had a great many other things to consider when he arrived in Philadelphia in May for the opening of the Second Continental Congress than slaves, although this could not have been far from his mind. He took his old uniform out of packing, and he wore it as a discreet way of suggesting to the Congress that the time for talk about reconciliation with Britain was already over. But the uniform also succeeded in suggesting a few other things to the Continental Congress. Washington was put in charge of a committee to plan the defense of New York City. He was then appointed chair of the Standing Committee on Military Supply. And ultimately, his easy, soldier-like air and gestures persuaded the Congress that Washington not only had the requisite military experience, but also represented the interests of the largest of the colonies. And on those grounds, on June 15th, Congress offered Washington overall command of the Continental Army, an army which did not actually yet exist. He wrote a small acceptance speech, begging that it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare with the utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with. But the next day he began planning to join the Army of Observation outside Boston. And on June 23rd, with his new major generals, Charles Lee and Philip Schuyler, in tow, Washington headed off northward. He rode, carrying with him the news that his new army, without waiting for its commander-in-chief to show up, had managed to embroil itself already in a stand-up slugging match with the British Army at a point across from Boston, across the Charles River, called Bunker Hill.